Mesh, 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 mesh. And we are back. And we're talking about the mesh tool, if you couldn't tell. So, the mesh tool, in essence, and it's going to be the 19th icon down, or it will be the 10th one down if you have your double column layout for your tools panel. And again, your tools panel usually is on the left hand side. This is just how I have mine set up. So, our mesh tool looks like, I call it a leaf icon, but essentially it's a rectangle with mesh lines inside of it. So that's what it is, but if it makes it easier, think like I do and think, oh, the icon looks like a leaf. You can find that by clicking the U button on your keyboard, and that switches to the mesh tool. So before we get started with that, in order to get a mesh to work, we have to have a shape with a fill. It does not work on strokes, it only works on a fill. So drag a shape out onto your artboard. And then we're going to explain what a mesh actually is. When you look at your mesh tool, again, it's a rectangle with mesh lines in it. And essentially what the mesh tool does is it creates these lines once you clicked in your fill. So let's click in the center with our mesh tool. And you'll notice it places lines from that point, which is now a mesh point, and this shape is now a mesh instead of just a shape. It puts, from this point, it connects to each side of your shape. It has to. That's how it works. This builds a net, so to speak, that allows you to create different points along this shape or this new mesh that will allow you to manipulate each point independent of any other point that's in that mesh. So if we were to change this, we can change both the color and the opacity of this point or any other point in our mesh. So let's go, and we're going to change this to a yellow. And you'll notice it then gradates out to each corner from where its anchor points or its mesh points connect. Now you're not limited to that. You can also change the opacity of that. Let's say we change it to 20. And how do we know that actually worked? Well, let's create another shape, and let's put that shape behind our mesh and change the color. And you'll notice that now the color shows through. Okay, so that's how you can verify that this actually has a set transparency level. So if we were to change that and go back to 100, you no longer see the cyan rectangle that's behind it. Okay, now you can add more mesh points, and then we're going to add one here, and then we're actually going to change the color of that one to purple. And you'll notice every point that you add will maintain the information from the last one. Or you can click points, and you can always change what it looks like by switching that color on that specific mesh point itself. You're not limited to one type of color or one specific point. You can continue to add them as you see fit. Now with your mesh points, you can manipulate each individual point independent of the others, like said before. But that means you can also move them. Alright, so you can push and pull them, change them from left to right, up and down, and you can change their handles, so that also changes the flow and direction of the gradation of colors. So if you look, you'll notice as I move this, it's actually changing how those colors are interacting with the other mesh points. And this is something you'll learn to do as you get more comfortable with the mesh tool. Now, what you should be wary of is that the mesh tool can be very, very complicated. And that's when you're trying to get a complicated shape or gradation. So you have two options here. A lot of people will, let's say we were doing something that's more of a, let's do a complex shape. Let's do a couple of circles combined. And let's do it like this. And we're going to merge these circles. Let's say this is our shape. Now, it could be any shape, but let's say it's actually this one. And we're going to make it cyan. And let's say we went to make a mesh point. Remember when we did it in our rectangle, it was like perfect. But as you start to get to certain areas, you'll notice, as we can see here, some of the mesh points will jump outside of the line. And that's only because you don't have a distinct, perfect up, down, left, and right shape, like a perfect square or a rectangle that's going to keep all the mesh points in order. It has to figure out how to jump around these actual corner points to maintain the shape. And quite often, it does not know how to do that. And or it's just extremely difficult. So let's change the color of some of these points. And then we're going to see what happens when we change the color of, let's say, this point. You'll notice that it hits really, really hard around this edge. And the reason being is because it can't properly change to this point, which is its next point, because it's going outside of the boundary edges. So if you were to push and pull this handle, you'll notice how it flexes, but you still have this sharp line, which 9 times out of 10 you're not going to want. One of the ways that you can utilize to get around this is you can, and I'm not going to go fully into this because it takes a while and you have to be really, really patient. You can create, let's say, a square, and you can actually make it a mesh, and then individually you can add and change the anchor points so that it matches the shape that you were just looking at. And once you do that, you can then add and remove different anchor points accordingly, and they will adjust at a perfect ratio to what you're doing. You got to start with a basic shape and then build your complex shape around it. Now, although there's that single way of doing it where you can manipulate the shape and then use that to actually build around it, you can develop multiple individual meshes that align over one another to actually fit within the shape and or area that you're trying to make. And you can make them simpler so that way when you're doing them, it's not so difficult blending your points. Like, you may have wanted this to be of 0 opacity and then this to be 0, but if it was one single shape, it might not have given you the actual result you wanted. So you can do things like that and then make that into an overall composition by just adding a bunch of the shapes on top of each other. But again, it's a tool that you really have to practice with, get used to. Your best bet is to pull the photograph in if you want to get more advanced with it, and then try and go over it. I may actually do an advanced tutorial on this. I am not sure as of yet. So we will see. Just stay tuned, check out the other tutorials, and then we'll see where we go from there. All right.